Hello, everyone.
Fantastic.
My name's Kate Coleman. I acknowledge the multiple countries and nations that we meet on here today. I meet you here from Wurundjeri Willem country, a land of old stories that has never been ceded and continues to hold great knowledge spaces that enable us to do really powerful work in thinking about what new knowledge systems are needed, and how we might engage with old knowledge systems to actually recognize and understand what it means to know and be and do as an Australian young person and person in our institutions. I'm moderating this session this afternoon, as well as speaking with two of my colleagues I work on a large international study with. And we're excited to share some of the findings of a study that's been undertaken during COVID. I'm here in Melbourne, based at the University of Melbourne. We have just opened today into a little bit of freedom as our stage 4 lockdown has ended at midnight last night. So I have actually been outside today, outside into the world, and actually had lunch outside of my home. So hello, everyone. Our session is called Teaching and Learning in COVID Times, Recognizing the Multifaceted Expressions of Knowing. Chris, hello.
Hi everyone. I'm meeting you from the Campbell region, which is in Queensland, in Brisbane, just east of Brisbane. Welcome today, and I would like to also introduce our colleague Melissa Cain, who's at the Australian Catholic University, also in Brisbane. And Melissa, the way we'll be talking is I'll start us off, then Melissa comes in, and then Kate actually comes in and does the last part of the presentation. And I guess, Kate, if you can go to the next slide. So earlier this year, obviously, we had a pandemic started in China, and our universities in Australia were very, very concerned by this because it meant our international students couldn't get in from China, and we have a large number of international students. Obviously, things then progressed, and we all found ourselves in March, towards the end of March, in lockdown in various ways. Someone called Louise Phillips from James Cook University actually contacted us, or did a call out on Facebook in early April, and said, who would like to look at how teachers are living through this pandemic? And I'd like to do a project, and I would like to know more about their stories and their lived experiences. And from that Facebook call, there were 9 academics, and we're 3 of those academics. Academics were from Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and the US. So Louise, although at James Cook University, and Australian University actually is based in Singapore, and we had 1 colleague from New Zealand, 1 from the United States, and the rest of us were on the eastern seaboard in Australia, from Melbourne through to Brisbane, or the sunny coast actually. Slide change, thanks. So as part, and I just realized, I just want to go to the chat. I have some tiny URLs that I can share to people. So the first one here is I'll just send it to everyone, is the actual study. So if anyone happens to want to participate. But the study, we ended up using a whole heap of tools, and we went through social media about the study. And we asked teachers from all walks of teaching life to participate in the study. And you can see here is a really nice post by Kate asking people to participate in the study. And we used Facebook and many methods. So we used a snowballing technique through which we gained participants. And you can see this post was retweeted by someone in one of the unions, and saying fantastic that we're really looking at hearing about teachers' actual stories. And slide change. So around the stories, what we actually did was we had to use a number of tools. But first, let me talk to you about it. We sent out this call asking teachers to participate in the study. And we focus not just on higher education, but on, you know, primary and secondary education as well. Now, our story today, or what we're going to mostly be sharing, is the higher education aspect. So we formed a subgroup from the 9 academics into a subgroup of 3 where we do focus on higher education. Our other focus is on quite a few of these tools. So what we have is we've used a variety of tools here, and you can see from the list there's quite a few. Now, some of them are really quite nice and really, really helpful for the study. So one of them is, when we analyze the data, is Voyant, and I can send that through to you all so that you can see the URL. And we use tools like Zoom to collaborate. We've used another online tool to collaborate when we had our meetings. We also had to do things like work out time zones. And although the 3 of us were initially on the same time zone, obviously now we have a different time zone. We used Qualtrics for the survey, and we actually used a Griffith University account for that. When we got ethics approval, James Cook University got the ethics approval first. Then I managed to get that second through Griffith, and each university subsequently did get ethics approval for the study. One of the other tools we use is otter.ai, where we record our meetings and then we can do what we want with that transcript. So that's another tool that's really, really nice. So Kate, moving on to the next slide. So as I said, one of the other tools we used was ePIC. And if anyone wants to go to the ePIC site, and yes, and the URL is there, but I'll give it to everyone as well. To go to the ePIC site, what you'll find are a lot of curated artifacts from, what is that? There's a start recording thing. Okay. Curated artifacts around COVID-19 and around education. So you can go in there. You can also search the posts that we've actually presented or done fairly some of the parts of the study, but you can see we've curated a lot of the other stories as well. And one thing I wanted to say just around the tools, even though we did actually move on, is I just wanted to also mention that we did do a blog post on the tools that does really talk about them in detail. So now what I'm going to do is move through to Melissa, and Melissa's going to talk about the larger study.
Hello, I'm Melissa, and I'm talking to you from the lands of the Turrbal and Jagera people here in Brisbane. I think we were pretty impressed with ourselves that after meeting and getting a questionnaire together, that we were actually able to open the questionnaire, the survey, in early May. So our respondents were right in the thick of it and trying to work through all the different challenges and pass the barriers. 16 open-ended questions. There was a lot of information, a huge amount of data that we received, and we're very happy that our respondents really stuck with the survey all the way to the end. I think they wanted to tell their story for sure, and they wanted people to listen. So we have 635 responses to date. And what's really nice here is we have responses from early childhood educators that are dealing with issues around cleanliness in early childhood centres, all the way through to higher education contexts. We have put some of the Australian data, we got that out pretty quickly in an article in The Conversation. So that is there. You can read it if you'd like. And I think the key theme that came through there at that time was that educators were saying, we're just exhausted. We are so tired. This has really put a lot more workload on us. So there's some data there in that article if you'd like to read it. Slide change. So out of that 635, thanks Kate, we had 105 respondents in the higher education arena, and most were coming from Australia and New Zealand, Australia and the USA, but we also had some Pacific respondents as well. What was really interesting is that the vast majority had been teaching for over 10 years. And we would have thought that if you've been teaching for that many years, you probably would have been teaching online, you would have gained some experience, but there were only 10% out of all of those respondents who were already teaching online before COVID hit. So that had really quite significant implications for the 90% that were thrust into this, some of them overnight. And some of our respondents said, we had 2 days to get our act together. Some in the US, actually, they had universities broke for a couple of weeks. They brought their spring break, I think it was, forward so that respondents could start working on taking everything over to online teaching. Going through the comments, everything really hit home for us as educators here in Australia. And I think all of us, all of the whole team have read the data and cried at times. Some of the stories were particularly distressing, and others we were buoyed by their ingenuity, their creativity, their resilience. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yes, so there's that figure again that only 10% were teaching online. And really those respondents weren't familiar with even the most basic tools. Most of our educators have had a lot of experience in higher education. So 78% in Australia were teaching for more than 10 years, and there were 40 respondents within that cohort. I think we might move to the next slide. So between our Australian data and our US data, using those 2 case studies, there were emerging things that were very similar. The US differed in a couple of respects that we didn't find in Australia. Everybody said they loved teaching, and most importantly, they wanted to teach well. They wanted to continue the quality, and were coming up with some barriers and coming up with some challenges and working ways to move past those. Most, I think, had indicated they would prefer the face-to-face teaching, and that's probably coming from those who haven't had any experience on online teaching. Those relationships, the rich conversations that you can have face-to-face, and how are they going to do that online? But also realising that although the challenges remained, they are adaptable, flexible. They were seeking all sorts of information from all sorts of places to try and move past the challenges. We also learned that our academics in Australia showed a great deal of empathy, so that they realised that their students were having the same challenges. And so they were more flexible with due dates, giving of their time for one-to-one student consultations. So there's a quote there, online teaching it's more tiring and less rewarding than face-to-face. And that was something that came through from a lot of our respondents, particularly in Australia. Next slide. All right, and our US cohort. So 93% had more than 10 years teaching experience, and a little bit more, 14% were already teaching online before COVID. And we might just go on to the next slide. So some of the themes that came through, and this is the same with Australia, is that the suddenness of the shift was the hardest part. They just didn't have that lead up time. It led to anxiety, it led to increased workload, and then coming up against both pedagogical and technological obstacles and searching for answers to that. But COVID did prompt the respondents to start thinking about how do they like to teach, what's important to them, and how are we going to find ways of keeping that going in the online space. So they were forced to engage with new technologies, and for some educators, the very basic technologies were new for them. And that was something that they took pride in learning. With the US respondents, there seemed to be a greater emphasis on students from low socioeconomic areas, students that were now having to work because the partner had lost work, or everybody in the shop was sick with COVID. I have to keep going. I can't go on with university. So the more of those financial concerns that really changed the way teaching and learning occurred with the US cohort. And once again, the teachers, the educators had genuine concern and empathy for their students. What I thought was interesting in both cohorts was a question around, what are your students doing differently in these times? And most of them said, that's a good question. I don't know. I haven't asked. So that might be a point for the future. We're worried about what we're doing and just trying to stay afloat, but more of the, what are you doing? Have you come up with some innovative solutions here that we need to have a chat about? So once again, the final word here is the educators realise they are resilient. We can do this. We are resourceful. We've looked for all sorts of answers, particularly creative in solving problems, and that we have a heart and we understand that it's hard for everybody. Thanks, Kate. Is this me again? Yes. Okay. All right. So we realised that our respondents gained in a number of ways, and we put them into two camps here, digital and relational. So we have, as I said before, some students, some respondents who had never used Padlet. They never even heard of Padlet. So for them, that was being innovative, or trying to avoid a just talking lecturer and to use some breakout rooms. Others, more experienced educators, and perhaps those that had already been online, you can see there in the middle paragraph, we've got some new applications that they thought, I've heard of it, or someone's mentioned it, someone said they use it. I'm going to take some time, the time that they don't have, to learn how to use these applications and platforms. They reached out primarily to their colleagues. They reached out also to their networks, their educator networks, and TED Talks, YouTube videos, a whole host of ways of gaining that information. We have recently submitted a little article on the US data, and it was just so nice to see these quotes at the very end about what have you learnt about teaching and learning in COVID-19 times. And we were buoyed by the respondents' comments in that they're adaptable, particularly under this extreme pressure. We've got challenges, but I can meet them. I can do it. I can be flexible. I can be adaptive. And a nice comment here that planning to teach a course online has actually improved my in-person teaching. So that was a really nice gain as well. And this last quote, teaching through an online interface has encouraged me to deeply examine my underlying theoretical understandings regarding teaching and learning. So this respondent came back to the very base level and said, what is it about teaching and learning that I truly value? And so with that, knowing they teach through a relational lens, exploring new ways to build those relationships in the online space.
Thanks, Melissa. So with that large digital and relational set of data, we've started to ask these questions as researchers in the higher education data set about who recognises what has been achieved. If you look across just those specific, very small bits of quotation that we've been able to pull out of the stories, you can see there that there's a number of professional knowledges, professional skills, and really a range of capabilities that have been developed over time, but in a really fast-paced time. Some of these people, if you remember the original data set, have been in teaching for a long time. And so here they're now at a point in their careers where they've actually had to undergo major change really quickly. So if I go back into the data and have a look at what's impacted on their teaching and learning, with this lens of recognition, some of the things that they were doing were under these other kinds of pressures, not just living in a pandemic, but also being at home, and increased in teaching and learning and long hours on that, a lack of preparation because the pivot was an actual pivot. It was a stop. And if I use my old netball analogy, to pivot is to stop and turn really quickly and get the ball and then one step move. You know, to actually be able to do that requires a lot of training. You know, when you're a kid in Australia playing netball, you do that for hours at training each week because it's a particular step that actually requires expertise. And these teachers didn't have that. They had pedagogical strength, which we think is what has actually been able to shift them into this space quickly. So even though they didn't necessarily have this skill or experience, they had these attitudes. They had a rapport, and there were limitations in that rapport though around effectiveness because of the communities that they're working with. And in some of the data, we can actually see that there's really, really strong university learning and teaching teams. Again, if thinking about their recognition, the support that they've done in this kind of pivot is also a really interesting one that may go unrecognised. There's a conversion of teaching resources and an approach to redesign that is a particular set of expertise around educational technology. If we think of the role that a learning designer or educational designer and academic developer play, some of our academics have had to undertake all of those roles at once to actually think about what a whole redesign of their pedagogy might enable. Digital pedagogies are quite different spaces. They actually require a lot of front loading of work, and these kinds of videos and modules that had to be co-developed before teaching. The actual teaching space, the physical space that we're in, has a lot of nuances. We have a responsive and relational pedagogy, but in Canvas, for instance, that goes until I get to Zoom. And one of our big learnings from this is that Zoom is a classroom for most of our colleagues, but that also requires a major impact and change into this online move. And an increase in student needs, where we're actually having to be really flexible around what our students were also feeling in a kind of hopeless world at the moment. How we supported the well-being of our students was a really important component that we're seeing right through the stories. And as Chris set up, as a study, we're also involved in this as 9 academics who've had to do exactly the same piece of pivot work. And had to shift our teaching and shift our research and shift our assessment online really quickly, meant that, we are a part of this same community that we are researching within. The biggest impact we've seen throughout all of the data in all of the countries is this technology shift into Zoom and Collaborate, and then more meetings. So you're teaching in Zoom and Collaborate. You're also having learning and teaching meetings, research meetings. This is where you kind of started to live your life, including if you were meeting family, probably, having dinner with family on Zoom at the same time that evening. So there's some big pieces here, again, thinking about recognition. So who and what are your key knowledge sources for teaching remotely is a question in the study. These are recognition sources, so if I think of colleagues and peer groups and communities of practice, these came out as the top communities where knowledge, information and strength and support were coming from. Second was professional associations and forums and resources. So here again is a place where recognition can be undertaken. These are communities that could be supporting the kind of shift that we've seen our educators undertake. Professional resources online, so that they're going to this expertise online, to TED Talks, as we found. They're going into Coursera MOOCs, Khan Academy. They literally list off a range of technologies for us. But who is recognising these shifts, pedagogical shifts in practice, that's enabled these broadening of professional learning? There's a self-experience. So this is an important piece, particularly in the open recognition environment and open education space. I've had many conversations with Don and Serge for years about how we recognise our own capabilities. And here is our participants telling us that the self, they were their biggest point of reference, that they had to, through reflective practice and their own experience, reflect on that, reflect on their pedagogical strength, go out to their communities to get that information, to be able to do what they needed to do. And then here you see in our top 5, the university in-house. So there's PD resources, there's online tech support. You know, I don't know about you, but I, you know, have spent many an hour at the beginning of this online to my own university tech support in trying to kind of troubleshoot some of the issues that started to be seen when we first went online really quickly. Another point of recognition here, if I think around partnerships. So these kind of partnerships we talk a lot about in open education, open recognition. And if you think about even the ePortfolio community, partnerships are incredibly important to help us in our pedagogical work. So in this pivot, though, that happened really fast, the support in teaching and learning came from, first and foremost, in our data professional associations. These are communities that are already set up and establishments as global experts ready to roll, but not necessarily always having the same impact that they've had during COVID, where we had to turn to somebody very quickly to actually support this shift. University departments, again, are there, and learning and teaching support. So who's recognising within the university, for instance, is a question we have of our data set. You know, as researchers, we feel like we're in almost a position where we could actually certify a range of skills and technologies that we're seeing inside our data set. But who is it that does the recognition? And how does that recognition, if we know in terms of that open badge currency and economy, who are the best people to be evidencing and warranting what it is that's been done during COVID? And is it colleagues, the self, is it social media groups? How do we support communities of practice, for instance, to actually recognise the amount of work that's been done by colleagues? So Chris set up before, one of the tools we've used a little bit is a digital humanities tool called Voyant. This is a Voyant word cloud looking at the data set. So Voyant is a way to see through data. Here's an image of the data that looks at this question: what innovations have you forged or experimented with? Inside here, you actually see, which I think is really interesting, is students. Now, what this does is pull straight from the qualitative data set, and it creates actions about the way that words are used across the data. Students and using and Zoom and online then start to actually see the ways that they're thinking about innovative practices. Improvisation is in there, screencasts, breakout rooms. They're thinking differently about the way that this digital classroom can actually be a working environment that actually enables a collaboration and engagement. But you see in here things like different, designing, infographics, adapting. They're actually having to do this experimentation on the go, live, in class at exactly the same time as they're redesigning, rethinking and recreating their own learning and teaching as they go. The stories then around encountering are really important when we think about recognition. Learning online, if we just take those two words out of this, are really important when we talk about recognition of academics. They've learnt online at the same time as they've learnt to teach online. That's a really significant piece of work that we, the three of us, discuss every time we meet around this data, because, you know, as Melissa said, we've been really affected by this because these are stories of encounters, but the encounters have been ongoing. They have been relational in the way that they talk about the communities that they're working in and the groups that they're working in, but they're fast paced. So they're using these videos, they're using URLs, they're using Zooms, they're relying on their communities, but having to keep going without having a point in time where you stop and pause and reflect and go again. It's a continual literacy development that you're doing over time without really having time then to stop. And a time to stop will hopefully be a point when we can actually recognise what was actually achieved in a very short time. If we think of the Australian context, and I think the Global South in our research is really important, looking specifically at Australian and then American data, is that we teach year round. And so we were went into lockdown, at least in my circumstance, I went into lockdown and went home from teaching in March. I am still teaching at home. So I'm, on eight months worth of teaching at home, being in my house. My students are in their own homes. I teach art. Yesterday, I had a 3-hour live sculpture session. Each of us, some in bathrooms, some in kitchens, me out on my balcony. This stuff we've all done at the same time as our participants, and being online and learning to be online, and then learning to teach online. And then for our students, learning to do whatever disciplinary practice they're working in online has really been a significant encounter with digital spaces that does need a recognition from a digital economy to be able to say this stuff happened, and this stuff, where's the evidence of that? And we can actually warrant and recognize and certify that evidence to demonstrate what you've done professionally. And then we have the student piece, which is really interesting if we want to talk around recognition. And the session that Professor Patsy Polly was in earlier today around attributes and things that often go unseen when we talk about what students are able to do in assessment. There's a gratitude here for face-to-face teachers and this is from the teachers' perspectives about what their students learn, but a really interesting finding that is at the top of this data set, that there's a campus system that we know our students really love and admire, that they now had a gratitude for, that they were removed from it. They became independent, resilient, critical learners. There's a kindness and empathy and trust and sharing that we've witnessed across our students. There's online learning pros and cons that they didn't know about before, but they now can see how it affects them as learners and how what the impact on their learning is. There's a self-awareness and a self-care that we've witnessed right across, and this is looking internationally at the higher education data set, and that they struggle and want to get back to a normal, and how we actually support and recognize these cultural shifts that our students are undertaking is also something that we can see this research will make an impact on in higher education. So what is the evidence we wanted to have a discussion around? What we know from our data is that our educators have used a really big variety of platforms and technologies, and like Chris established in our study, we have too, because we've been learning to do research online at the same time as our teachers were learning to learn online. And it's clear that educators came to a strong realization that a deeper and more nuanced familiarity with digital tools was needed to replicate that meaningful, affective, relational space that they have in a face-to-face space. Remember, only 10% of them were teaching online. These are traditional face-to-face classroom practitioners who have now shifted online, but wanted not to take their teaching online, wanted to be able to recreate the affect of relationships. And that was an important thing that they have now come to terms with and worked out how to use the technology to do. Again, something that goes unrecognized often in academia and what professionals are doing in their role. Really big ideas here. I am a key resource for helping others with online learning and teaching. Now, to me, that's a piece of evidence in someone's credential. I gained more confidence in myself as an educator and in my ability to innovate and adapt to new situations. Again, who recognizes and certifies these particular statements around professional aptitude? We talk a lot about attributes of students. I think the attributes of our colleagues are what we, as you know, in that powerful role we're holding here, holding this data, is that we can see that, but who in their institutions is actually going to recognize and certify and evaluate this piece of work? I gained more confidence in myself as an educator, and I'm able to innovate into new situations. So our big questions for us to have a chat around, particularly in what we've seen, but what's recognised and what skills and what knowledge and what capabilities, and then who recognises and why is actually this important? What is it about the changes that we've seen during COVID that we actually need to pay attention to? And particularly in the precarity that we're in Australian higher education. I know not everyone in the world is undergoing the major shifts that we're undergoing in Australian higher education, but we are day by day seeing professionals who've done this amazing work either early retire or be made redundant from their roles. We're in a very precarious time in Australian higher education, but the kinds of skills that we've just shown to you really do need an open recognition, a recognition not just from their institution, but possibly from the wider academy. So we'll open it up to a discussion from us. And then if there's anyone else online with us at the moment, and then hopefully in our recording, we will post our Twitter handles and you can stay in contact with us and follow what is published on the project. Chris or Melissa, did you want to follow up on anything? And Patsy, did you have any questions of us?
I thought Patsy might have a question.
Yeah, I do have a question. Thank you very much for a really, really interesting presentation. I, as a person who also pivoted in March, actually enjoyed the process. And I'll tell you which bit I enjoyed the most. I think it was the experimentation bit. Having been a scientist for so many years, I enjoyed the fact that I was a little bit uncomfortable, but could get through it. Okay, so the experimenting bit and trying things out, and then the aha moment when it worked, and coming together with colleagues on a daily basis, actually, in our department to share practice was the most astounding shift in collegiality that I'd seen in recent times. So for me, that was really important. And you've touched on that the skills are developing. Who is going to recognize these skills? And might I pose that it's actually via peer review as the experts that are co-learning, co-implementing, co-designing all of these practices on the go initially, and now they're set. Yeah. So that's what I think is the next piece of work, maybe.
Yeah.
To have that peer review element to it as a form of being able to recognize those skill sets more globally and talk about them.
Mm. Yeah, agreed.
So well done. It's excellent to have captured all this because it is an important moment in time. We are learning from the change, and with change comes the fact that we're pretty uncomfortable, but I think we've gotten through it pretty well.
Yeah, we've seen in this, and I think what we're seeing is a resilience across all sectors in our study, but particularly in our higher education data. Mm-hmm. There wasn't, and interestingly, there are some people in the data who've actually left academia, and mainly because the Northern Hemisphere data, they ended the year. What's interesting around our data is that the survey remains open because up until now, Melbourne has still been in this, and the Northern Hemisphere has only re-entered back into teaching again. So we also have, which is the amazing bit of using the metadata in Qualtrics, we also have the timing of the points across the pandemic. And who knows how long this goes on for, but we'll be able to track these encounters over time, which I think is one of the most important parts of this study, to actually watch the shifts in global higher education that we've possibly not seen before. I've not necessarily seen in other pieces of research, impacts on teaching. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And the vast majority did not leave their jobs. They stayed with it, and they're proud of that, proud of what they've achieved.
Yeah. Chris, did you want to add anything into there?
Sorry, Patsy, I'm having a hard day.
Yeah.
No need to be sorry. I think it's a very interesting concept of how to evaluate these skills and how to get parameters around what they can look like.
Yeah.
We've actually been trying to talk about that. So, we're trying to look at the data to see, what recognition we could give people. And then as part of our data set, we do have some email addresses, but we thought about contacting people after getting an ethics amendment, obviously, to contact them and then saying, we could do open recognition if you wanted us to with your data, but only doing it once we have permission, obviously thinking ethically. So we're definitely going to explore the data more with regards to this. And I actually think that we could give badges, through one of the systems as well, so that people are recognised.
I'm just thinking we've just come from a very big staff meeting. Well, we're not a big cohort, but about and one of the things was the performance reviews on hold at the moment. But I think within our corridor, we could easily get some system together where we go around and we peer review each other and we add that section to our performance review, all of us saying that this is important.
It's a really important piece of work. And again, why within our study, the shift and specific look at higher education is important, because the sector changes that we're undergoing in higher education, firstly in Australia, and I think we'll probably see impacts on around the rest of the world post-COVID, are really important to be moments of recognition, as what will even be covered in the ePortfolios Australia conference in a couple of days, a conversation around the professional identity now of the precariat in the academy. As higher education shifts and changes, there is impact on our roles. And how is it that we actually engage with those identities and get recognition of them from our colleagues is really important. So I think, just being able to speak with colleagues and get them to peer review this kind of evidence of change is one of the things that the Open Recognition Alliance has been actually trying to do for some time. Serge has written a number of wonderful manifestos around open recognition and the role that the self and then the peer plays in evidencing and warranting what it is that someone has done that would otherwise go unwarranted by those communities. So this moment in time is a chasm that Patsy's presentation earlier today looked at, and these chasms we actually, with this data set, have something quite amazing to play with, because as Chris was saying, we have the contact. I mean, if you think about what's inside an open badge, you have the standards that sit inside it as to what it's been issued for. You have the standards as to who it's been issued by. If you look at just the 9 academics of us, Chris in her amazing leadership role in Ascolite, each of us in the work that we've done across digital pedagogies and spaces for many years, just the 9 of us. So we've got then the standards in terms of kind of baking that badge. We've then got the evidence in the story that they actually wrote us, including the responses to each of the practices and platforms and technologies that they've undertaken. And we've got their signature, we've got their email address. So, that's how we bake a badge. And we have that whole connection there to actually think about what this is. We had a meeting about it weeks ago, and we were all so darn excited that we could play a role in actually recognizing the amazing things that we see in this data, because it is completely unbelievable. When do you ever get to read the stories of academics in a pandemic? I mean, you don't often get to read the story of an academic often anyway. It's built around a particular set of standards for promotion or grant applications, not just a story about who I am and what I've done. It's a great privilege to be in this project. So what do we reckon? We're going to tie us up?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I think that was a really good wrap up.
Excellent. I'm going to stop recording then.